They opened the shutters before dawn, when the air over Blackwater Bay was still and thin as glass, and the city's breath had not yet risen to cloud the horizon. The room in Maegor's holdfast warmed by inches as the river of light parted the dark and slid across floor stones worn soft by generations of shoes. Daenerys sat on the window seat that arched over the gardens, her uncovered feet tucked beneath her, a thin shawl around her shoulders despite summer's hold. She let the air pass over her face, salty and a little sour, tinged with smoke from 100 cooking fires and the acid of tanneries that never slept. A gull tilted and corrected over the outer harbor, white on white sky, and for a moment, she watched it the way she had watched gulls as a child from the roof of a borrowed house in a borrowed city. Missandei stood beside the window with a sheet of parchment and a string of wax seals like dark grapes upon a ribbon. "Petitions for the morrow," she said softly so as not to disturb the quiet which Daenerys held around herself like a cloak. "Though perhaps for the day after, depending, Daenerys said, allowing a small smile, "on the patience of lords and the heel-dragging of small counselors." Missandei smiled in return. "On the generosity of a queen who seldom leaves a petitioner unheard." The seals bore arms old and new: trout, falcon, kraken, sun and spear, a lion reduced to a small corner of red wax. In their pressings lives she did not know yet spread out across the 7 kingdoms she had come to claim. Claim and then gather. It was one thing to climb a throne. It was another to braid a realm made of wind and thorn. "The wedding is today," Missandei said, as if there were a risk Daenerys might forget and wander instead to her dragons to breathe the morning with them. "The Septon arrives at first light to consult the Lord Hand. There is also a northern matter. The Godswood." "Ah, yes," Daenerys said. "The Red keeps Godswood, a green court walled by red brick and careful hedges where no weirwood grew. There were gardens here, but not that. He will want the ceremony there." "So he said." Missandei glanced down. "He did not command it." "He never commands anything for himself," Daenerys answered. She let her gaze fall away to the shadowed shapes of the dragon pit's broken ribs on Rhaenys' hill. Her dragons had made a home there without the dome and the iron lattice of their forebears. The old stones were black with age and soot. The great pit was no longer a ruin. It was a nest. "There will be 2 ceremonies, then," she said, "as the realm requires. Let the Septon bless our hands with the Seven's oil. Let the old gods hear our words, even if they listen through other leaves. The Master of Whisperers says those of the faith who would make a rumpus will find one no matter where your hand is bound." Missandei replied cautiously. "Let them," Daenerys said, not sharply, but with a firmness that carried a long distance. She let Missandei sit with her, and they listened to the city together. The wind veered, bells, far and pale and separate, breathed out from Visenya's hill, where the great September once stood and where now scaffolds drank up coin like thirsty wood. There were no small folk voices yet. Those came with the sun, the barrowmen who sang to their mules without knowing, the fishwives whose calls cracked like whipcord, the children who laughed without asking permission and knew the patterns of guards better than any captain. For a breath, a quiet as deep as the narrow sea lay over the city. "He is out with Ghost," Missandei said after a time, as if confiding something that had slipped the meetings and papers and formal talk of days. "Ser Davos says he left before the first bell. He used to walk the grounds at Castle Black before dawn," Daenerys said. "He said the wall moaned at that hour like a living thing. Here the walls do not moan. They remember, though." She let her palm rest on the painted wood of the window ledge. A dragon had been carved there along the edge, wave-shaped and stylized, its scales rubbed down to a soft satin by 100 monarchs' hands. "Send for the seamstresses," she said at last. "The gown needs finishing, and Missandei, you are to wear the blue. It suits you better than that pale green, no matter what the Tyroshi thought when they sold it to you." Missandei laughed lightly and withdrew. Daenerys looked once more at the shadow of the dragon pit and found herself steady. Drogon would have stirred. Rhaegal would have his head tucked beneath his wings still, dreaming of flame-colored goats in the green field of his mind. She would see them when the sun was higher. She would see them and feed them, and then she would come back to be bound with oil and with water, and with words that did not belong to the language of her mother's people or to the hard flint words of the north. She would weave a rope out of them anyway. In the red keep's small god's wood, a pool lay under a ring of sour leaf and oaks, glassy black as if it hid a night of its own. Jon sat with his back against a trunk that had stood when Aegon's host first raised canvas on Aegon's high hill, when the foundations were lines of chalk and the Iron Throne a dream only part battle and part story. Ghost's head lay across Jon's thigh in a way that made the direwolf look more dog than shadow, though the scarred ear and the pink eyes ruined the illusion. Jon scratched behind that ear and watched the last lanterns of the nightships wink as men on the piers put them out to make room for the morning. It was cool in the shade. The oaks held a secret breeze and the smell of damp earth that reminded him so strongly of Winterfell's godswood that the sharpness of it pushed against his ribs. His first thought when he had seen the Queen's gods would have been that it was too tidy. A courtly thing, a garden for whispers. Winterfell's heart tree bled onto the ground, and the ravens took tea. He read from its roots like a benediction. This pool had no weirwood to look into him. The city wore the seven, and even its quiet places had been trained to the shape of them. It did not matter. A vow spoken must be heard. He had learned that at his father's knee, whoever his father had been, and at Maester Aemon's knee when the old man spoke of things that outlived men's names. Ser Davos says the Septon wants to put a brazen crown on your head as well as hers. Came a voice behind him that had the grin already in it. Tyrion stepped out of the path with his hands clasped behind his back, the look of a man strolling a vineyard. He made a show of grimacing at the bottom of his left boot, as if he had stepped in something offensive. Ghost's ears pricked. Then, reassured, he closed his eyes again. "I told him not to," Jon said without turning. "I won't wear a crown." "You wear one already," Tyrion said, leaning his shoulder against an oak and joining Jon's gaze into the water. "It's only invisible to your own eyes. I am not a king." "Very convenient," Tyrion observed dryly. "For you, and even more convenient for those who will test you. They will come with petitions wrapped in silk and with knives wrapped in innocence, and some will come with both. If it consoles you, being a king has historically proven fatal. One may hope your humility extends your tenure by a day or two." He pursed his lips, thinking, "She wants the godswood. She wants both," Jon answered. "She always wants both. She thinks a rope braided of different fibers holds better." "She thinks about ropes," Tyrion said, amused. "A good thing in a city of knots. The Faith are making their antiphons louder. The Northern Lords will sing a different song under these same branches. It is a thing to admire, how you have all developed taste for harmony now that the music is yours to conduct." "I did not ask for this," Jon said, and the words tasted old and foolish immediately, like something children said when told they must lay down a game. He swallowed the rest of it. "What does the Master of Coin say? That he misses the days when the crown's debts were theoretical, like dragons," Tyrion replied. "Now he must balance both. The Iron Bank sent a man with eyebrows like white paint. He speaks softly. That always makes me fear the most. Have you decided?" "I have decided to decide after your vows are spoken," Tyrion said. "It is a better day for deciding then. The scent of roses makes men more generous. The scent of blood makes them honest. For matters of coin, I prefer generosity. So it will be the anointing oil's work I lean on, not steel's." Jon scratched Ghost's other ear. "They all say different things," he said. "Brienne says keep the Kingsguard small so it can be trusted, and Grey Worm wants it larger. Davos says ships before spears. Yara Greyjoy wants us to promise the Isles their old freedoms, which were only ever freedom to take what was not theirs. Sansa writes that we must keep the harvest in the north for the north. Sam writes that we must send the stewards to count, and count again." He looked down into the pool. The water shook with the weight of Ghost's breath against him. "And here, my hand is to be tied with hers. It is odd, isn't it?" Tyrion murmured. "How the smallest moments are the ones that tip the world. I gave my wife a string of blue glass beads once, and the next time I saw them they were in a puddle of wine beneath a table at a feast. I knew then that my marriage would not last. There are beads on your day that will not crack, I think. The dragons are a different matter. I must go make the city look more like itself, which is to say less dangerous. Did you know the Alchemists Guild complains of the dragon's warmth? They say their fire has interfered with their substance. Their pride keeps whatever it is in its jars. I'll speak with them, Jon said. That is King's Landing, Tyrion said, spreading his small hands. A problem so absurd it must be real, and real enough to burn you. Be careful today. Some men smile because they mean it. Others have simply grown tired of being seen with their mouths closed. When Tyrion had gone, Jon sat until the sky was a pale lid over the bay and the first coarse voices came up the hill. He didn't pray because when he had prayed in the past it had been to a tree that wore a face. The prayers he knew were not words but the way he stood, the way he looked into the wind and waited, the way he took up Longclaw to pass the sentence and then swung it himself. Yet he shaped one now the way he had seen others shape theirs, a simple thought shed of self-importance. If you are there, hear us both. Let me keep what I must keep. Spare those who do not deserve a second ending. Ghost lifted his head and made that silent sound that was not a bark. Jon rose. His knee was stiff, whether reminding him that men were not made of iron unless they were put on a throne of it. The day moved through the corridors like a tide. Servants traveled its edge, leaving behind the smells of clean linen and beeswax. Guards carried it on their shoulders with polished steel. The queen's own pace made a seam through it into which others stitched thread. Daenerys wore white, not because the court seamstresses thought it appropriate, but because she had chosen it when the silk was still uncut. Over the silk, she wore a slighter thing that had not passed through any tailor's hand. A chain of beaten silver that lay like an outline of scales across her collarbone and nested there as if it had grown with her. Her hair was braided with 2 small sapphires, not for extravagance but because Missandei had said they brought the sea with them, and Daenerys knew she would need the sea in this city. She paused in the passage before the throne room to lay her fingertips for a heartbeat against the warm stone of the wall. A tiny thing done quickly and watched by no one but a sleepy scullion boy who did not recognize the gesture for anything but what it was. A woman steadying herself. Then she walked forward. They had chosen not to be bound in the throne room, not under the fused swords that Aegon had demanded and that his descendants had sharpened upon one another's backs. The ceremony of the 7 would be held in the Queen's Sept, a small and lovely place with carved pillars that widened at their capitals into flowers and stars and where, if one tilted one's head in the right way, one could not see the faces of war. From there, they would go into the Godswood, and from there, to the Dragon Pit for the Oaths of the Realm, those 3 places making the shape of their day. The sept was full but hushed, like a hand cupped around a flame. Above, tiny panes of colored glass stitched the first real light into threads over the stone. The stranger's window spilled a long rag of pale purple across the floor, surprisingly gentle. The High Septon, newly elected, a man whose cheeks were more lined than his robe, stood already at the altar, the oil and the book beside him. Before him lay a cloth embroidered with a dragon and a direwolf, their threads more like shadow than beast, so they would not look as if animals had been captured and nailed down. Daenerys did not look at the throne more than once as she passed the open doors through which its edge could be seen. It was there. It would sit inside its cage of space and time today like something patient and ancient. It had eaten many before her and would eat more after. The rule of her life was not a chair. At the foot of the altar, she paused. The courtier's rustle settled into something close to reverence. She heard the sliding step of Davos Seaworth approaching, and his Southron bow was awkward only at the very end as he suppressed a grin. He wore a cloak of new cloth, and it still looked like a second skin on a man who had made do with salt and burlap most of his life. "Your Grace," he said, "the hand begs me to tell you the procession is ready." "Is he prepared to be solemn?" Daenerys asked. "For 100 heartbeats. Mayhap," Davos said gravely. "No more." Jon came into the light at the other end of the nave, Tyrion beside him on stumpy stride, Brienne gliding on his other side in white cloak and polished steel as if she had been born to stand between a man and harm. Jon wore black without ornament, the Stark in him speaking, but at his throat lay a small clasp of darker metal shaped like a three-headed dragon in flight. It was a simple thing, hammered and chased, and for one half-beat a memory moved through Daenerys so quickly she could not catch it. Her brother's voice when they were very small, before cruelty had become his only language. "Look, a dragon, look." He stopped before her. Their closeness made the rest of the world flip from figure to ground. The High Septon began to speak, and he had an unadorned voice that suited the modest place. Oil, cool at first and then warmer, touched Daenerys' temple and then the back of her hand. She smelled frankincense and something like clove. The words were old and had been said so many times they had worn smooth. She listened with her head turned slightly toward Jon so his breath touched the small hairs at the edge of her ear. "Do you wish to be joined?" the Septon asked in the end, where words could still change the line of two lives. "I do," Daenerys said, and her voice did not tremble. She felt it move through her, and the weight of it did not feel like a shackle. It was a yoke she had chosen. "With him, I do." Jon spoke the same words in a voice that had always been careful with what it gave away. The Septon nodded as if pleased with a student's answer. He bound their wrists together with a cord the color of unspun wool. Their hands made a bridge. The first cheer rose and fell like a wave beaten back by the place's hush. In the Godswood, there was no hush and no lantern glass. Sparrows jostled in the hedges, and the oaks breathed in unison like old men. A northern lord with a beard like frost took them to the pool's edge. Sansa stood to the left with a cloak over her arm, gray and new, as tradition demanded but trimmed with a narrow strip of white fur that turned the thing from symbol into thought. Arya leaned a shoulder against a tree with her arms folded hard, a small smile like a knife tucked into the corner of her mouth. At her belt, the little sword shone in the dapple. Robin Arryn watched as if he were not sure if he approved but knew that if he did not, his refusal would matter to no one. Edmure Tully held his wife's hand and looked every inch a man surprised to find himself happy. They spoke no long words there, only a few that meant more than their length, words that acorned into something larger when left alone. Jon's right hand brushed her left as they traded a leaf between them, and Daenerys was aware of their fingers more than of the lords watching. She thought of the heart tree at Winterfell, where red wept from white bark like wine from a cut skin, and imagined this pool's surface stirring as if that tree rolled in its sleep far away and, in rolling, sent a shiver along the roots of every tree in the realm. When the token leaf sank and did not return, Sansa stepped forward and placed the gray cloak with its thin fur across Daenerys' shoulders. The fur lay cool against her collarbones. For one heartbeat, she felt like a girl standing before a hearth in a winter house, steam rising from her hair as it dried. "Sister," Sansa said, with her voice pitched for ears that were close, not far. "Queen." The two words stood without quarreling. And then there was the light. They came down Aegon's high hill in a tide of bright metal and darker wool. The clink of harness and the buzz of voices. Bells peeled free from their ropes by boys with arms already sore. The heat leaping up from paving stones as if the sun had not been absent all night. The dragon pit dominated the hill up. Osite, a great black bowl with jagged rim like a crown that time had chewed. Its wide yard had been cleared. The old chains lay coiled and useless against a wall like the skins of a snake that had outgrown them. People waited there, nobles in their measured knots and clusters, small folk pressed like grain ready for the flail, unsullied in lines so fixed they might have been drawn, Dothraki whose hair rattled with bells when they stamped and laughed, sailors with their arms folded, the city watch with their gold cloaks sweating in narrow stripes. The air trembled with something that was not heat. They saw the dragons before they heard them. Two dark stains against a pale sky, made small by the distance and then larger as they grew. Larger until the eye understood that it had erred. The first shadow clicked into shape as Drogon's wings brought him level with the broken rim. He did not land. He passed once above the yard, vast and without need. The second shadow followed, head swinging, green bronze and lit from within like a leaf held to the sun. Men who had thought themselves done with wonder since boyhood made the involuntary sound that any small creature makes when a great one passes near. The dragons came down one at a time, because they had learned to do so without breaking the earth. Drogon struck the ground with the noise of something inevitable and lowered his head so that he looked like a mountain range moving. Rhaegal folded himself more neatly, like a thought put away. Their breath came and went, and the smell of their bodies, charred bone, iron heated and cooled, something like rain on hot dust, slid over the crowd and quieted it. Jon and Daenerys stepped into that quiet together. The herald made a fuss of titles because that was his work, and because men in silk liked to make words do the lifting before the steel must, and because, somewhat to everyone's surprise, the names fit. When he had finished, when Lord Protector of the Realm had been breathed into the air along with Queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, when the last trailing breaker of chains found a nook to lie down in, the lords came forward to bend knees that had bent before other monarchs, and the men of the city raised their few rough cries and the sailors their own more vulgar ones. The oaths were heard. They were recorded. Tyrion nodded imperceptibly to a scribe whose quill drank as fast as a courtesan, and the words went from voice to ink to parchment to something that could be recalled and argued with in a dark room. Yara Greyjoy knelt just long enough to satisfy those who had to see such things, and stood with a grin that cut sideways. "You have your kingdom, Dragon Queen," she said. "We have the wind, and I will have no priest's hand on my helm when I steer. You will have our captains when you call. In return, your soldiers will not tell the sea what to do." "The sea does not listen to us," Daenerys said, "any more than the land listens to you." Yara's grin widened. "Then we understand each other." Edmure Tully's oath was courteous and held, though he swallowed when Drogon's head turned toward him and one pupil narrowed. Gendry Baratheon, new-made Lord of Storm's End by residual right and newer politics, knelt and rose with an expression that said plainly he had not yet learned how a lord's face must be a mask. His smile showed a boy who had once worked metal and now worked men. He met Jon's eye and nodded as if to a fellow who had held a hammer. Even Robin Arryn did it properly, coached by the maid who always stood half a step behind him, a woman whose presence in any place made that place feel more likely to survive the next hour. The Lord of the Reach was not a Tyrell. Too much had burned and drowned. A cousin with the look of a hawk wore the green and gold now. The Martell who had journeyed north was a woman with a face that kept its secrets and fingers as slender as whips. She spoke little and watched much. They went through the ceremonies with the inexhaustible patience that rank demanded. It took less time than winter and more than a battle. When it was done, when the last rim of the sun had cleared the low roofs and made the city into a bowl of hot light, when the court had broken into its smaller gatherings and the work of rule resumed its quiet chewing at the edges of celebration, Jon and Daenerys stood together in the shade of a half-standing colonnade where wind could find them. The dragons lay with their bodies pressed to the earth, content as hounds in a courtyard, watchful with the aspect of gods drawn in ink. Jon drank water from a wooden cup and let the extra run off his chin into the dust. Daenerys did not drink yet. She stood with her eyes tracking the crowd, the habit of a year and a lifetime not easily dropped. The way a horse that has been harnessed turns its head when it hears leather creak. "You are thinking of the ships," Jon said quietly. He knew her face well enough now to read its lacunae. "And the grain," she said, nodding. "And the Iron Bank." She glanced at him, and her mouth tilted. "And the bed." "A little. That last is the easiest to come by," he said. He had never been light. Humor for him was something that moved in a narrow channel. It reached her now. It softened her shoulders a fraction. He noticed that the chain of scales at her throat lay exactly between two of the small scars that Dragonback left on a rider's skin. "Come," she said. "We will walk. If I stand here too long, they will bring me more words with gold leaf on them." They left the shade for sunlight, the heat bending up from the stones and making the air wobble around their ankles. The guard fell in. Missandei made a shape to a company that kept clerks away but let certain truths through. Davos joined them with the motion of a man falling slowly into step. Tyrion trailed, his cup apparently impossibly replenished, his eye moving the way a man's eye moves in a gaming hall where he odds are printed on the wall in paint only he can see. They walked the edge of the dragon pit where the old chains lay like sleeping eels, and where lilac had been planted, and where children had already begun to leave small offerings. A stone smoothed by 1,000 hands, a red ribbon, a carved piece of soap in the shape of a fish, a soldier's thumbnail chipped off with a knife. The city made its own rituals because the city could not be told not to. A woman stepped forward from the press at the boundary rope. She carried a soft bundle wrapped in rough linen, and her face had the pallor of one who had bled recently and not entirely stopped. The guards moved, but Jon lifted his hand and Daenerys' hand lifted a breath after. The woman held out the bundle, and because it was so clearly what it was, they have always known, Daenerys thought. A queen's face is a mother's face writ large. Daenerys put her forearms out and took it. A newborn blinked up at her with eyes that could not yet focus and hair as black as coal dust. The skin was wet and wrinkled, a smell both sour and sweet rising from the folds. The infant made a sound of outrage that sounded small because everything was large around it. Men's hearts melted into the sounds they made when such small things cry. "He was born with the bells," the mother said. "I named him Baelor, but the midwife said you should name him. I do not know if that is a thing queens do. I do not know how these things are done now. They change and change. My man was a mason before the fire took our street. The hands said there would be work. There is work. There is always work." She spoke in a tone carefully kept flat, as if she knew some ears would not suffer much relief heard too close to morning. Daenerys adjusted the linen to keep the sun from the infant's face. "Baelor is a good name," she said gently. "Baelor can do well here." She looked at Jon. His eyes, which had traveled from the woman's face to the baby's and back again, softened the way they did when Ghost pressed his head against his knee in the night. "If you will," she said, "take him to the sept and ask the septa to look after the mother for a day or two and the child longer. I will send a purse later. Tell your husband to come to the dragon pit at noon on the morrow. There will be work and pay proper to it." The woman did not know how to bow with a baby in her arms, so she did a little tilt that was both awkward and more dignified than any curtsy done on polished floors. She drew back and was absorbed into the crowd as a drop is absorbed into a tide. "All hail," Tyrion murmured. "Queen of complications." Daenerys handed the child back, feeling the tiny weight leave her wrists and the ache of it remaining. A ghost of a feeling that was not grief and not longing and not even relief, exactly. "It's the only crown that means anything," she said. "The rest we can melt and hammer again." "Speaking of melting," Davos said, "if your graces will forgive an old man, the Alchemists Guild sends word there were bottles broken last night. Green drops where green drops should not be. Me, I don't fancy any more of that in this city. We should be wary, even happy days." "Ser Davos," Tyrion sighed. "Would you like to retire your title and add a little drum you can beat whenever the rest of us seem in danger of smiling?" "If my Lord Hand would promise to listen, I'd beat no drum," Davos said. He was smiling himself. "But I'll be plain. There's men in this city who think the world ended the day the Targaryen dragons went away, and others who think it ended the day dragons returned. Both like to start the end they fancy most to be proved right. We will visit the alchemists," Daenerys said. "After the meal, let them show their jars. Let them tell us what they are afraid of." "You know what they fear," Tyrion said evenly. "Irrelevance." "And if that is so," Jon said, "they will have my word that no one will open their jars except at their own command. But if any one of the jars opens itself unexpectedly, I will make a jar of the man responsible and keep it in the dungeons where it can look at its own green face." "Have you considered," Missandei said with the brightness of someone who will be heard, "asking the Citadel to send an Archmaester to live here for a year? Not to advise and counsel, but to walk the city. A scholar's feet touch different stones than a soldier's. A scholar can see why a guild is anxious. Knowledge is a spice that makes bitter things go down." "An Archmaester," Tyrion mused. "Excellent. Samwell Tarly will suggest 3 overlong treatises on the matter, and then propose himself." Jon's mouth twisted without his permission into a genuine smile. "I would not object," he said quietly. "Too much book in a city of fire will smother it," Davos muttered without heat. "Yet perhaps a little balance, They ate in a square of patched awnings raised quickly by clever men who saw coin in shade. The food was plain because Daenerys had asked for it, and because her experience of feasts had engendered in her a distaste that was not quite disdain. Platters piled high with the sort of meat that carries behind it the sound of a thin child crying. Thin children often cry when men want extra courses. Bread, cheese, figs, olives, fish from the morning, salt. She tore bread with Jon and put a piece into his hand as if they were soldiers, or as if they were in some little kitchen where no one knew their names, and then he did the same. A boy of the city danced at the edge of the awning for coppers, and when Davos threw him one, he bowed and flipped the coin off his nose and then vanished into the crowd as if swallowed by it. When they rose, the shadow of the dome's bones had shifted across the yard, and with it the shade in which the dragons lay. Drogon raised his head and drew his nostrils open and shut as their scent moved again. Daenerys went to him and placed her palm against the rough scales of his face, the way a woman might touch a stallion she trusts but does not forget can kill her. Rhaegal's head slid close as well, and she let her hand rest there a moment before she stepped back toward work. She and Jon went together to the alchemists. The guild hall stood not far from the Dragon Gate, a squat building with a long face and no humor. The door was old and studded, the iron heads slick with polish. Within, the air was thick with the scent of strangeness. Resins and gums and oils and that peculiar metal smell that accompanies old secrets. A man met them whose hair struck out in gray clumps and whose eyes burned with feverish composure. He bowed, and when he straightened, he did not entirely straighten. "Your Graces," he said, "we are honored. We had hoped you would come. The dragons. There is something to be discussed." "Master Haleen," Tyrion greeted, remembering. "A pleasure to see you that is equal to seeing a viper on a path, only if the viper could speak and call itself your friend. The jars, if you please." Haleen did not like Tyrion. Haleen had no choice. He led them into a long room where a row of fat clay jars sat on a shelf like the bellies of fat men drawn neatly in a line. Each had a wax seal. A few had drips like the dried tears of candles at their mouth. Haleen gestured with a hand that trembled minutely. Not enough to be a symptom, enough to be an admission. "Two of our apprentices," he said, "have left us. We believe them stolen. There were sounds at night. There was evidence of interference. There is, you must understand, a substance refined here that should never have been allowed to be refined at all," Tyrion said softly. "It is part of the city," Haleen snapped, losing his tone for a moment before gathering it back. "As much as the gods or the brothels. Your Grace." He inclined his head toward Daenerys. "Your children's breaths stir it. Our work is altered by their presence. We do not know if that is good or ill, but it is change. Bring those who run your night," Jon said. "We will give them more men until you tell us you feel safe. No jar will be moved without your say. But if we find any in the city not under your sight, we will empty it in front of you and then break its keeper's hands." Haleen closed his eyes, then opened them. "Thank you," he said. It sounded like a man admitting a truth when all he had wanted was to win a game. When they left, the air of the street seemed cleaner, even though it was fully summer now and the street heaved with life. Daenerys breathed as if she had been holding her ribcage still for an hour. "Why do men keep things that can burn them so easily?" she asked in a voice pitched not entirely for Jon. "Because they think they'll be the one to control it," Jon said. He was thinking of dragons and of kings and of those two words that had haunted him since birth. Wolf and bastard. He was thinking of the sword on his back and of the pain a man carries when he mistakes his hurt for his cause. Missandei glanced at him and looked away, because she was not his confessor, and because she did not always want to write down what she heard. In the afternoon, the petitions began. They were more or less what petitions always were. Neighbor against neighbor with a fence between them. A seller angry at a buyer whose coin was shaved. A monk griping over taxation of a barrel of wine that had been for the poor and had been diverted to a wedding. A mercenary with a scar across the side of his face claiming pay for a service against raiders that a lord denied had ever happened. A troop of mummers asking permission to change the face on a mask because their collection lacked a convincing queen. Tyrion presided at Daenerys' left, Davos on her right, Jon slightly behind and listening. attentive to the way small problems became large ones when ignored. He knew the shape of a gathering storm. He had been a man who watched horizons for a living. Some the small council heard and dismissed with grace. Others they put aside for inquiry. One, a small girl whose hand had been crushed in a mill, Daenerys could not bear to send away with only words, and so she went down the steps of the dais and crouched on the same level and unpinned the chain at her throat and put it into the girl's good hand and closed the fist over it. "This will buy more bread than it should," she said, "because of what men believe about metal. Let them be fools. Eat, grow. The crown has your name now. It is written, and ink does not forget." It was an untidy way to begin a reign. It was a human way. It meant that the scribes would have a week of calculations to find the back of that gift in the ledgers. It also meant 100 mothers would hear that the queen's eye could fall on someone like them. Tyrion did not sigh. Davos scratched his beard and smiled into it. Across the court, a lord who had arrived that morning from the Vale narrowed his eyes to slits because generosity often offends men who own more than they need. As the low sun began to fill the broken bowl of the dragon pit with gold that looked like grain, Jon slipped away. He had learned how in Winterfell when the weight of ears and eyes grew too heavy. He moved along the edge of the yard where shadows held and followed a path men had made with their feet because it took the most direct line between two places. It led him to one of the great arches that opened onto the city, and then to a narrow stair down to where the pit's bones met the slope of the hill. There, a gap in the old stone wall, widened by children. Certain gaps always are. Looked onto a small lane that ran behind a cobbler's, then turned and spilled into a broader way that glowed in the dust with the day's end. It was quieter there. The city made a different sound when you stood half outside it. He leaned for a moment against the wall, grateful and not wanting to name the thing he was grateful for. Cat appeared on the wall, as if it had been there all along, amber-eyed and dusty, and watched him with the absolute indifference of a creature that knows itself sovereign in 1,000 forgotten corners. He offered his hand to it. It sniffed, declined to give an opinion, and leaped away. "You are him," a voice said near his knee, because a child had that view of the world. Jon looked down and saw a boy watching him with curiosity undiluted by fear. He had a gap where a tooth should be and eyes that were green not with beauty but with the city's old cunning. He wore a shirt that had once been blue and was now the color of water where horses bathe. "Him?" Jon asked softly. The boy nodded. "The prince what has no crown." He said it like a title. Children give titles to things they like. Jon half smiled. "I am Jon." The boy seemed to evaluate this as if it were not enough. "I'm Tallow," he said, "because of my ma'am. She works the candles." He pointed vaguely toward the alchemists. "You look like the tall folk what come to buy the wax. Only you don't smell like a lord." "What do lords smell like?" Jon asked. "Like lemons and a lot of hot." "I have been outside," Jon said. He looked back up the hill toward the dragon pit, where he could see the dragon shapes against the sky if he leaned. "It's a warm day. Some of us live in the steppes," Tallow said conversationally, as if bringing up the weather. "Below the vault. We sleep there because the ground is a good bed when it's hot. Sometimes we put our hands on the stones and feel the dragons. They are like thunder that doesn't hit." Jon crouched a little so he was nearer the boy's height and found the angle in which his knee did not complain. "When you feel them," he said. "Are you afraid?" Tallow considered. "I was," he said. "Then I was not. Our house burned once. We like them because they burned our house but not us. A man threw a bottle and the fire came out of it like a tongue. Ma'am said he was drunk and stupid. Then the dragons came and burned the same street but it was different, and the men what did the first one ran away." He scratched his neck. "People don't like what hurts them unless it also hurts the people what hurt them more. We are people." "That is almost wisdom," Jon said quietly. "How old are you, Tallow?" 8 when you count summers," Tallow said. He puffed with pride. "If I stand very quiet near the pit, sometimes the green one looks at me. I think he knows. I think he thinks a thing." "He knows," Jon said. "He thinks. He is not a horse. He is not a dog. He is himself." Tallow stared, the kind of look a boy gives when he feels a story pressing against the walls of his skull. "Do you ride them?" he asked in a whisper that was louder than a shout. Jon nodded. "Do they say words?" "Not like we do," Jon said. "They say other things, and if you listen with the part of yourself you don't use for talking, you can hear." Talos squinted at this as if it were arithmetic. "I can hear my ma'am when I'm not in the room," he said after a while. "Is that like it?" Jon felt something in him, some old hardness, softened just enough that it might break later. "It is exactly like that," he said. They stood together until the bells that marked both prayer and the changing of the watch rang from the hill of Baelor. Jon left the boy with a silver stag he would not own for long, but that would make 2 good evenings anyway. He climbed the hill again and found that the air had changed. It had that quality it gets in late afternoon when everything prepares for something. Not battle, not feast, but the quiet moment when shadows begin to look like places instead of the absence of light. He found Daenerys in their rooms with her hands unadorned. She had pulled the pins from her hair and let it fall. He could see where the braid had been, the lines of it still drawn in the strands. The gown hung over a chair. She stood in her shift with her back to the window, and for a moment he did not walk in but simply stopped, the way a man stops when he sees a scene in a book he knows he will remember. She turned when she heard him. His face must have told her he had been somewhere gentle, because she came into his arms without a word and set her cheek under his jaw. "How much longer must we be made to stand?" she asked in the dry tone of a woman who knows the answer and will stand anyway. "One more room," he said. "Then the night. The night will be a council of its own," she said, a smile at the edge of her words. He thought of the bed not as a battlefield but as a harbor, and that, in a life like his, was something. He let his mouth find the corner of her eye, and she sighed a little, and then they pulled apart because the world was impatient. The last room was a small one in the Tower of the Hand, where the wall was lined in dark wood and the table had a plainer modesty than most things in the Red Keep. The chairs were comfortable and not gilded. The windows stood open. The company was smaller now. Tyrion, Davos, Missandei, Grey Worm in his stillness like water held in a bowl, Brienne upright, Sansa like a line drawn with a sure hand, Samwell Tarly having arrived with a speed that suggested he had been halfway to King's Landing for a week anyway, a Braavosi with eyebrows whose neatness could have cut bread, and the Lord Commander of the City Watch, whose silence suggested the intelligence of a man who had made a life of not offending at dinner. Tyrion seated himself with a little grunt that was almost a prayer. "To the mundane," he said, "to the bricks and barrels and beds of the realm." He lifted his cup. "We have a queen and a whatever Jon prefers to be. Now we must discuss what men who wish to unmake the world will prefer. We begin," Missandei suggested, "with a list." Lists had rescued her life more than once. She had been a scribe before she had been a counselor, and that part of her still believed that the beginning of any peace lay in writing the nom. Yes, of things. She took up a quill with a hand that bore only one ink stain and waited, poised to put common chaos into the service of ordered ink. "Debt," the Braavosi said in a tone of velvet that spoke also of iron. "The crown owns it as much as it is owned by it. We will speak plain thoughts. If you do not, it is a waste of my supper." "Grain," Sansa said. "The North keeps what is hers. We share, but we do not give away our winter." "Ships," Davos said. "More than we have, less than we'll need. Yara will make a noise. Let her. We'll need timbers made into keels, and men who know what a rope is for." "The faith," Brienne said, glancing toward the window as if the sound of chanting might ride in. "They must be appeased, but not allowed to drive. No more soldiers that carry cudgels and claim piety as shield for law. Mercenaries," Grey Worm said, "in the alleys. Men who fought for gold for Lannisters, and now do not have their gold. Golden Company remnants," Tyrion added. "Those who live learn to turn their coats inside out. They will do it again. Dorne," Sam put in as if reading from a list he had written months ago. He flushed when Sansa's eye flicked. "We have heard nothing. That is something. And the Riverlands. There are still men who hunt for prey there as if war were a season." "Dragonglass," Jon said. and everyone looked at him as if he had set down a dish no one had ordered. I have a reason, not for what is past, for what is to come. There are things in the north that do not care whose face sits on a throne. There are walls that do not need stones. There are words that make men forget. I want a store in every holdfast. I want stewards named who know what to do when the wrong wind blows. Sansa's mouth became very still. The ghosts of winter walked across the room and put their hands on their shoulders like relatives come uninvited to supper. If we call for glass and steel, she said carefully, men will begin to say the wrong words again. Let them whisper, Jon said. We will whisper louder with our hands. Tyrion regarded them both with an expression of pleasant interest that hid calculation like teeth behind lips. Very well. Let us set men to dig and cut. Let us set ledgers to balance. Let us set a guard to the guilds, and a bellman to watch the night, and a cupbearer whose honesty surpasses his urge to sleep on watch. Let us make a city that does not burn because one man is bored. Let us, Daenerys said, and there was a quiet in the room that no one acknowledged but everyone shared. It was the quiet of a people who had made it through the morning. After the council and before the first sleep with the weight of vows upon them, the city came closer to their room. Not by conscious design, because no design can make such things happen. Came the way tide comes. Men sang down in the street of silk, ribald and repetitive. Boys ran with torches and will and the sense that the world had leaned toward them for a day. A woman somewhere in the alley behind the Hand's Tower swore in a voice like smoke and laughed as if it did not matter. Fireflies made small coins of themselves above the gardens and were chased by maids who were old enough to remember, young enough to still chase. In their chamber, Daenerys stood at the washbasin and dipped the cloth into water that smelled like lemon peel because Missandei had insisted. Jon watched her in the mirror, his face sober as always and softened as it had been by the sight of a boy named Tallow. Without turning, she said, When I sat in the Queen's Pyramid at Meereen, there was a day like this. The city passed around me like a bowl of water passed hand to hand. I thought then I had reached the end of what I could be. I thought perhaps one should not ask more of a life lest it break. I was wrong. But now... She broke off, and the slightest laughter touched her. Now I think I may have finally reached it. He crossed the space that had been made into a courtship and then into a marriage and put his hands at her waist. He was careful not to wet her dress. We have not reached it, he said, but we have begun it. You always were a man of beginnings, she said, and turned to set her hands flat on his chest and feel the solidity there as if checking a wall for its soundness. Her eyes lifted and the last invisible crown he refused settled again upon her view of him and did not sit heavy. It was simply there, like the weight of his palm when it lay between her breasts at night and moved a little with her breath. They undid their wedding with their own hands, because that is how a wedding is kept, and the city hummed its old tune beyond the shutters and even the dragons lay quiet. And something like peace slid into bed with them and lay down and put its head on their ribs as if it had always known where to sleep. In the morning, the petitions would begin again. In the morning, a raven would arrive from White Harbor with a list and a warning written in a fair hand and Sansa's measured courteousness. In the morning, the Iron Bank's envoy would ask for a quiet audience. In the morning, a boy with green cunning eyes would put his ear to the warm stones and tell his mother the dragons were dreaming about rain. In the morning, in a lane behind the Alchemist's Guild, a man with a scarf around his face would pass a small jar to a man with a scar and say words that meant nothing except to those who preferred the smell of smoke to the smell of bread. That was all for the morning. The night wore on, and the city breathed, and the new shape of the realm held for one more hour as if made of silk that did not tear and of iron that bent only when asked. And if a wind rose from the south that smelled like far deserts and old roads, if a cold question moved through the gods would hear like a stitch pulled in Winterfell, if on the horizon of the narrow sea a single dark sail turned its flank to the moon, no one in the room where the vows had been laid and kept for a night heard it. They slept, which is its own kind of courage. Dawn came in through the shutters again, so gently that it hardly seemed to be the same sun as yesterday's. Daenerys woke first, because sleep for her had never been the deep, foolish thing it was for others. Some part of her had always held watch. Jon's breathing lay even beside her. She looked at his face ungirded by care and saw the boy in him and also the man he had become for others' sakes, and for her own. She could have watched him until the day burned itself out, but there was bread to be broken and enemies to be discovered and comforts to be arranged. And so she slid from the bed and put her feet on the floor and took up the chain of scales again and thought, for a moment, of leaving it off. She did not. She fastened it. She picked up the robe Missandei had left and shrugged it over her shoulders. Dragonbone combs stood in a cup near the basin, and she used one quickly, drawing it through hair that had known salt and wind and blood and was now clean and carried the scent of lemons from the night before. She was not a vain woman. She knew the polity of faces. She went to the window and looked down and out. Across the yard, a line of men stood with shovels waiting at a gate that had not opened yet. They were there for the dragon pit's work. Each held a token that meant he would be paid for his hands at the end of the day. The tokens were stamped with a dragon that looked less like a beast than like a wave. Farther down, a raft had been pulled to shore with its belly full of grain. Men were unloading sacks and complaining in the thin, nasally voices that men use when they measure a task by how soon they can say it is behind them. On a parapet, 2 Kingsguards stood as if carved. The light of the new day made their white cloaks look less like pride and more like duty. Drogon lifted his head. He felt her the way a fire feels a hand set near it. Regal unfurled a wing, then drew it back. Ghost paced below and looked up once, and then went on, because wolves keep their own counsel and are content when their pack is within scent. 3 letters, Missandei said from the doorway, her voice polite and not yet full of the world's edge. The Iron Bank. Lady Sansa, the Lubbers Guild of the Ropemakers. The last must be a complaint. The Ropemakers only ever write for complaint. Daenerys smiled. Let them have fleets of complaint, she said. With ropes enough for them all to hurl at us. We will take them and tie the world with them. And the first 2. Missandei tilted the letters between her fingers as one might weigh apples. Coin, she said. And winter. Daenerys nodded. Wake him, she said, not unkindly, because you cannot be unkind to the day and hope that it will answer with anything but spite. Tell him the realm requires its invisible crown. Missandei withdrew. Daenerys lifted the Iron Bank's letter with 2 fingers. The seal was neat and entirely sure of itself. She turned it over, broke the wax, and read. The words inside were dry and precise, with the politeness of men who own ships you must board whether you wish to or not. At the bottom, Tycho Nestoris had put his mark not like a flourish but like a sentence end. She set it aside for Jon to read, and took up Sansa's letter. Sansa's hand had grown into itself since she had last seen it. It had always been pretty, too pretty for hard work. Now it was clear without being ornate, as if the writer of it had found a way to be herself and survive. Daenerys read about stores and snow and men who would not work and men who did too much and women who sewed until their fingers bled and 2 little girls who had stolen apples and then put them back and been found out anyway and afterward rewarded with bread. She smiled faintly as she read. She did not know all of Sansa's heart. She did not need to. She kept the Ropemaker's letter for last. It was exactly what Missandei had predicted and also exactly the sort of grievance that grows into a riot if not addressed. Daenerys read it with the attention she had once given to a map of Slaver's Bay. When she had finished, she was no longer smiling. She laid the 3 letters together, like 3 cards laid on a table where a bet was to be made. Jon came out with his hair damp and his shirt still open at the throat. He looked at her and at the letters and at the day beyond her shoulder. The invisible crown settled into place and did not weight him. He tied his shirt with a quick, economical motion. What does she say? He asked. That winter keeps what it wants even in summer, Daenerys said, and that she will send us 100 wagons of grain only if we promise to let them be escorted by northern men. Done, Jon said immediately. She also says, in a hand smaller than the rest, that Arya has gone to sea and that we are not to worry, Daenerys added. Jon's mouth moved in a way that was not a smile and not a frown. Then we will not, he said, knowing they would and that the worrying would not alter the course of any ship on any water anywhere. And the bank, she said, holding that letter up and letting the light find the edge so that the wax shone like a beetle's back. Jon took it, read, and grunted. "We can pay with grain from the Reach and gold from the Lannister mines that are not as empty as some would pretend. We can pay with ships built in the Mander. We can pay with promises backed by dragons. They like promises until they smell smoke. They prefer promises to the smell of smoke until a certain amount of smoke makes them believe in the reality of a thing," Daenerys said. "And then they prefer to be far away. Tyrion will enjoy this." "You enjoy this?" Jon said unexpectedly. She looked at him sharply, then let the look soften. "I do," she admitted. "I enjoy it because it is a puzzle I can solve. I do not enjoy battles I cannot win. I do not enjoy being asked to break without the satisfa. Tie-in of breaking something in return. Break this," he said and kissed her. A brief thing, a seed thrown, not a harvest. She held his forearm to steady herself in the act. When they parted, she was smiling again. Outside, the city called for them, and the dragons arranged themselves so that their shadows would fall where their riders' feet would be. And a boy named Tallow placed his ear against a stone warmed by a creature both older and younger than the city, and told his mother that the green dragon had dreamed he was a leaf. And a rogue in a scarf opened his fingers over a jar and thought of green. The 7 kingdoms lay like a map for 2 pairs of hands to smooth, not to fold. Somewhere beyond the sight of the bay, a dark sail cut a narrow black line that meant a message and a messenger both. Somewhere in the north, a girl with a face like the wind's edge lifted a spyglass. Somewhere in the east, in a city that had once been hers and could be again, a man who had learned to smile with only his eyes began a letter with the words "Your Grace" that were meant to be both truth and trap. They stepped into the day together, and the day took them as if it had been waiting.